Hey everyone, it's Kelvin and welcome back to another watercolor tutorial for Procreate. So in today's video, I'm going to show you how I would handle a slightly more complex illustration, and we're going to paint this cute pumpkin and mouse fall themed illustration. So I've already got the Forster watercolor paper texture loaded into Procreate, and for the brushes, I'm just going to be using the brushes from the regular watercolor kit. And as usual, I'll put links to all of this in the description below. And that's also going to include the free sketch I'm using here, as well as the color palette. Now I've placed in the sketch here as the very top layer, and I've set it to multiply. Then I'm going to select a blank layer underneath the paper texture, and this is where we're going to start painting. Now when I look at a complex illustration, I need to kind of think ahead of time and kind of cut it up into different layers. So usually I will divide it by different colors. So for example, the pumpkins are going to be this orange color, the truck is going to be this red, and the mouse is going to be this brown color. So obviously those are all going to be on separate layers, but the order is a little bit more complicated. Now fortunately, this is a simple illustration. There isn't a lot of overlapping going on, but definitely here with the steering wheel, and that's because the arm is obviously part of the mouse, and the steering wheel is sort of between the arm and the body, and then the hands are on top. Like there's a lot of weird overlapping going on. So I'm going to solve that by actually just painting the steering wheel and just the mouse's hands on its own layer, separate from the body of the mouse. And I'll explain that later on, and I think once you see that, it'll make more sense. So for now, I'm going to go through and use the abstract round brush, and this is part of the regular watercolor kit. And I'm going to start by filling in the truck real quick using this red color, and I can grab that by just doing a long press with my finger, and it will just do this eyedropper thing. And at a pretty large size, I'll roughly fill in the truck here, and I'm trying to be pretty loose and blotchy, not worried about going beyond the edges here. And next, I'm going to grab the eraser brush, and I'm going to set it to the fine liner pen, and I'm just going to go along the edges here pretty roughly and basically cut out the truck. And after that, I can clean up all this extra watercolor with the eraser brush, but if you want to save time, you can use the selection tool. So I'm going to do that here. So I'll set the selection tool to automatic, and I'm going to tap and drag on the body of the truck and just set the threshold so it totally fills out the body. Then I'm going to go down here to invert, because now we've selected the body of the truck, but I want to select everything else. So when I tap invert, it just flips that around. It looks pretty crazy on screen, but I can open the layers panel, tap on the layer with the truck, and click clear, and it will clear everything that we hadn't selected. And that's just a time-saving trick because it can take a long time to just erase all that manually. And next, I'm going to go through and do the same process on all the other elements here, except the details. So I'm just going to use the orange on the pumpkins and then this kind of brown color on the body of the mouse, and they're all going to be on separate layers. So everything here is basically filled in, and I've cut them all out with the eraser and left these white lines, kind of gaps, I guess, intentionally. And this is just a style choice for me. I just like the way that looks. And the order of the layers isn't important for these three elements because they're not actually overlapping. They're totally cut out like puzzle pieces, and they fit together. Now all these other details like the stems, the wheels, the headlights, the hands, the face details, those are all kind of like last minute details that I'm going to add on a final layer. For now, I'm just going to go through and focus on the shading. So for the truck, I'm basically going to highlight and shade it so it has a little more depth. So I'm going to make sure I've got the truck layer selected. And I'm going to use the selection tool, set to freehand. And first, I'm going to darken all these fenders. So I'll select those, hue, saturation, and brightness, and I'll just darken them like that, just to make them stand off. And for the seat, I'll do basically the same thing. I'll just select the whole seat, darken it a little bit. Now the end of it, I'm going to darken that a little bit more. And then just along the back of the mouse here where he's leaning against the seat, I'm just going to do a slight shadow there. And the inside of the seat here, I'll just darken that. And I think overall, just to make this a little more interesting, I'm going to do a random selection. I'll feather it out quite a bit. Hue, saturation, and brightness. And I'll just maybe mess with the brightness and the hue and saturation. Maybe drop in a slightly more magenta tone, just to make it look a little bit more interesting. And then maybe just as a final touch, I'll use the eraser brush and cut a very, very fine line just to separate the cab of the truck from the back there. And after the truck's done, I can move on and work on the mouse. So I'm going to make sure the mouse layer is selected, and I'm going to use the selection tool again. And first, I'll make a freehand selection kind of around the face, and I'll feather that out. And I'm just going to highlight this. Now the ear in the back, I think I can just add a little bit of a shadow. And to make the arms kind of stand off from the body, I'm just going to select those, and then I'll darken them. And I think maybe as a last shadow, I'll add a little bit of a shadow down here in the lap area, just where he's kind of going inside the cab of the truck. Now there's kind of a weird hard edge here, so I'm going to smooth that out with the water blender. And if you want to, you can add a kind of texture to the mouse so it looks furry. So I'm going to make a new layer above the mouse. I'm going to grab the fine liner pen brush, and I'll just grab this pink color, and I'm going to go all over him here. I think that's a little bit too hard to see. I'll brighten that. And I'm going to add a bunch of lines like this, just basically randomly, but I'm going to try to follow the contours. So along the arms, I'll just go along like this. And then after that, because I did this on its own layer, I can lower the opacity to 0, slowly raise it back up, and just kind of set that furry texture just to a point where you can see it, but it's still pretty subtle. And then I'll just merge it together with the body of the mouse just to keep it simple. And there's more details to the mouse, but I'm going to add that later on. And now I can move on and work on the pumpkins. So I'll make sure the pumpkin layer is selected, and I'm going to use the selection tool again, and I'm going to shift the color, the hue of each of these pumpkins just to make them stand off a little bit. So I'll select the middle pumpkin first. Hue, saturation, and brightness. Maybe I'll darken it, saturate it, make it a little more orange. And the one on the back here, circle that one. So that's just to make the pumpkins a little bit more different from each other. Now for the shading, I think I'll just make the pumpkin here in the front, casting a shadow on the ones in the back. So I'll just make a selection along the edge like this. Hue, saturation, and brightness. And I'll just darken it. Now these pumpkins have these kind of lobes. So I'm going to select a handful of those and shift the color as well, but I won't shift the hue. I'm just going to make them kind of darker or lighter. So for example, I've got that one selected. Hue, saturation, and brightness, and I think I'll just brighten it. The one over here, I'll darken it, and I'm just going to go through and just kind of give these lobes a kind of variety of shades. And after that, I'm going to add a kind of global shadow along the bottom. And I'll feather that one out, and I'll just darken it. And after that, I'm going to add some highlights. So again, I'll use the same selection tool, and I'll just make a bunch of these random kind of arc-shaped selections, and I'm going to focus them towards the center of each of the lobes on these pumpkins. Just like that. I'll feather them out just a little bit, hue, saturation, and brightness, and I'll just brighten those. Next, I'm going to move on and start adding some details to finish up each of these different elements here. And because the mouse is sort of the focal point, I'm going to start with him. Now all the details need to be on their own layer. So I'm going to make another layer that's above everything. I'm going to start with pure black. And for the brush here, I'm going to use the fine liner pen. And I'm just going to fill out all the details on the face really quick. And if you want to, you can use pure white and add a little bit of a highlight on the corner of these eyes. Now the reason his face is a little bit grumpy is the same reason most of my illustrations are kind of grumpy looking, and that's because they're already cute enough by themselves. And by adding a face like this, a kind of serious expression, it makes the whole illustration look a little bit more sophisticated and less childish. And after the face is done, I think I'm ready to tackle this mess down here. So there's a lot of weird overlapping going on. And because the steering wheel is kind of in the back, I guess, in the back of the front, I'm just going to fill that in first. So I'm going to select pure black here. Same brush, fine liner pen, and I'll just fill this out real quick. And the hands are above the steering wheel, so I can fill those in next. And because I'm using the fine liner pen, I won't have any transparency issues. So I'm going to do a long press and grab that pink color. Now it's hard to see my sketch because they're black lines on a black steering wheel. So what I'm going to do is lower the opacity of this detail layer. There we go. I can see the sketch a little bit better. Now when I paint here, it's going to look light, but it's just the layer. So I'll just fill in the hands real quick. And once the hands are done, I can raise the opacity back to 100%, and you can see this a little bit better. Now while I've still got this pink color selected, I'm going to fill in the ear real quick. So the mouse could definitely use a couple more details, maybe some outlines, but everything pretty much needs that as well, so I think I'll do that at the last step so I can do it all at once. Next, I can move on and kind of work on the truck. So I'm still on that same detail layer, which is good. I'm going to change the brush to the abstract round and just use pure black to loosely fill in the tires. Then I'm going to use the eraser brush, still set to the fine liner pen, and I'm just going to kind of edit the tires so they're a little bit more closer to the sketch. And for the hubcaps, there's a little bit of a trick. So I'm going to start with pure white, and I'm going to use the fine liner pen. And first, I'm going to make a kind of rough circle there in the middle. After that, I'm going to select a kind of slight gray color, and I'm just going to spiral it out from the middle. And the reason I'm doing this is I want these to look kind of shiny or chrome. I'll select a slightly darker version again, do another spiral. Then I'll finish it up with pure white again and do a final kind of loose spiral. And I want these to have a kind of a red wall around the rim. So I'm going to select this same red color I used for the body of the truck, same fine liner pen, and I'm just going to add a ring around this. And that's it for the tires. Now the headlights are pretty easy. I'm going to do them a lot like how I did these chrome hubcaps. So I'll select kind of a slight gray color, and I'll fill those in. Then I'll select pure white and do some details. And then maybe I'll select a dark kind of a reddish color and just add a slight border around the edge. Now again, I could definitely add some outlines, but I'll do that later on. Now I'm going to move on and do the pumpkins. So mostly I'm just going to add the pumpkin stems, and I think I'll use the same brown color I did on the mouse, but I'll lighten it a little bit, and I'll just fill in all these stems using the fine liner pen. And just to add a little more detail, I'm going to lighten that color and add a couple of lines onto these. And then to finish this one up, I'm going to go through and just add a couple of outlines wherever I think it needs it. For example, on the truck, if I want to add some outlines along the fender, I'm going to make sure I have a kind of dark red color for that. And as you can see here, the outlines are pretty rough, pretty broken, and I'm just going to go through and do all the outlines just like that. Now there's one trick here that I don't think I've ever mentioned before in any of my videos, and it's how I weigh the outline. And what I mean is, when I press harder, it gets bolder like that, and I don't do that randomly. I'm actually trying to make lighter, thinner outlines towards the top of things, and then as I get closer to the bottom, I'll press harder and make a kind of bolder outline. And there we go. I can just turn off the sketch here, and this one is all done. And here's what it looks like when I print it out. I know this is a little bit of a more complicated illustration, but I like to show you guys sometimes how I handle that, and I'd love to hear what you think about this in the comments. And that pretty much wraps it up. As always, thank you so much for your support. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.